In the quiet suburbs of Scarsdale, New York, nestled among winding driveways and perfectly manicured lawns, stood a grand estate that once echoed with laughter but now carried only silence. The Grayson Mansion, with its towering columns and ivy-draped balconies, was home to Nathaniel Grayson, a 65-year-old investment mogul whose fortune had built skyscrapers and moved markets, but could not shield him from heartbreak. Since the death of his beloved wife Eleanor, the house had felt colder, emptier. The warmth she brought, once filling every corner of their home, had vanished, leaving behind only the hollow rhythms of routine and regret. His son Leo, just 8 years old, had retreated into himself. The once bright-eyed boy, who used to race down the hallways with toy airplanes and ask 100 questions before breakfast, had fallen silent. After Eleanor's passing, Leo stopped speaking altogether. Doctors called it selective mutism, triggered by grief. He hadn't laughed in 6 months. His right hand, once so quick to grasp a crayon or tug at his mother's sleeve, had grown stiff, almost paralyzed, an ailment no specialist could explain fully, though trauma was the suspected cause. Nathaniel, once commanding in boardrooms, found himself powerless at home. He tried tutors, therapists, speech specialists. None of them could reach the boy. The only consistent presence left in the mansion was Clara, the quiet housekeeper with silver-streaked hair and a calm demeanor, who'd worked for the family for over a decade. She moved through the home like a ghost of comfort, never intruding, always observing. And though Nathaniel barely noticed her anymore, it would be Clara, not the doctors or experts, who would one day find a way to speak to Leo's silent heart. After Eleanor passed, something inside Leo dimmed like a candle suddenly smothered. The once lively boy, full of wonder and curiosity, seemed to vanish overnight. In his place was a child withdrawn and motionless, as if frozen in time. He no longer spoke, not a word, not a whisper. Even when spoken to gently, even when asked his favorite things, Leo offered nothing but silence. His eyes, once wide and sparkling with questions, now stared blankly at the floor or out the window, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Worse still, his right hand, the one he used to draw with, build puzzles, and hold his mother's hand, had grown limp and unresponsive. Doctors ran tests, examined scans, and offered long explanations filled with medical terms. But at the heart of it, they all agreed, grief had taken hold not just of Leo's spirit, but his body. It wasn't physical damage, but emotional. Trauma had locked away parts of him, and no one seemed to hold the key. Nathaniel watched helplessly. He sat beside his son night after night, reading stories aloud to a boy who never looked up. He brought home gifts, toys, even a golden retriever puppy, but nothing broke through the invisible wall Leo had built around himself. The boy who once sang in the bath and told his mother knock-knock jokes before bed was now a shadow in his own home. And while the house remained spotless, the air inside it grew heavier with each passing day. Nathaniel, for all his power and wealth, could not find a way back to his son. And Leo, adrift in his own silence, seemed further and further away, until a quiet gesture from someone unexpected began to shift the stillness. Clara had worked in the Grayson household for over 12 years, moving through the grand halls and quiet rooms with the steady grace of someone who understood both silence and sorrow. At 52, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. Her silver-streaked hair was usually tied back in a simple bun, and her clothes were always neat, practical, without frills. To most, Clara was just the housekeeper. She arrived before sunrise, left after sunset, and spoke only when necessary. But beneath that modest exterior was a woman with stories she never told, dreams she had long since folded away. Few knew that Clara once painted. In another life, long before mortgages and medical bills, she had filled sketchbooks with color, portraits, landscapes, soft impressions of a world she viewed with deep feeling. Her small apartment still held a few fading canvases stacked in a closet, untouched for years. She stopped painting when her husband fell ill and the bills began to pile up. Art didn't pay for medication. So she packed up her brushes, tucked away her talent, and turned to steady work, first as a cleaner, then as a housekeeper. One day became a year, and a year became a decade. In the Grayson home, Clara remained a quiet fixture. Nathaniel rarely spoke to her beyond polite instruction. Leo barely acknowledged her presence. But Clara noticed everything. The way Leo's shoulders tensed when footsteps approached, the untouched meals, the lifeless eyes of a boy who had once known laughter. She never pushed, never asked. But deep inside, she recognized something familiar in the child's silence. It was the same silence that once lived in her own home, long ago. And though she hadn't painted in years, something told her, maybe it was time to try again. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon when Clara passed by the playroom and paused. Through the slightly open door, she saw Leo sitting alone on the rug, his small frame hunched over, unmoving. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft patterns across the floor, but Leo didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on a plastic box of crayons, untouched, sealed shut, as if it were something foreign. He didn't reach for them. He didn't blink. He just stared. Clara hesitated at the threshold. She hadn't been assigned to clean that room that day, but something in her feet wouldn't let her walk past. Quietly, gently, she stepped inside. Without saying a word, she knelt beside the boy and placed a small canvas panel on the carpet between them. Then, in the softest voice, she said, "It doesn't have to be pretty, just paint what you're feeling." Leo didn't look up. His eyes never left the crayon box. Clara didn't push. She gave him a moment, then quietly rose and left the room. The next day, while tidying up, she returned to the playroom, and stopped cold. The canvas she had left behind was no longer blank. Smudged across it were wild, tangled strokes of color. Deep blue, angry red, jagged streaks of gray, no shapes, no patterns, just raw emotion splashed across the surface. It was messy, chaotic, almost violent, but it was something. The first something in 6 long, silent months. Across the hallway, unbeknownst to her, Nathaniel stood half-shrouded behind a column. He'd seen the colors too. For the first time in a long while, his breath caught, not from fear, but from a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. The morning after discovering the painted canvas, Clara was wiping down the kitchen counter when she heard footsteps behind her, measured, deliberate. She turned to find Nathaniel Grayson standing there, not with his usual air of distant formality, but with something more hesitant in his eyes. "Clara," he said, voice low but clear, "could you join me in the study for a moment?" It was rare for him to call her in like that. Usually, their conversations were limited to household tasks and brief pleasantries. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, nodded silently, and followed him down the corridor into the wood-paneled room that smelled faintly of old books and cedar. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. Clara sat carefully, unsure of what this was about. Nathaniel didn't sit. He stood near the window for a moment, hands in his pockets, staring out over the backyard where the leaves had just begun to turn gold. "I saw the painting," he said finally. "The one Leo did." Clara's posture stiffened. "I hope I didn't overstep, sir. I didn't mean to." "No," he cut in gently, turning to face her. "You didn't. In fact, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." He paused, searching for the right words, the way someone might search for footing on uneven ground. "I'd like you to spend more time with him. With Leo. Each day. Just an hour or so. Keep painting. Or drawing. Or whatever it was you did yesterday." It reached him. Clara blinked, surprised. She had expected to be scolded for interfering, not invited to do more. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she said slowly. "I'm not a teacher, Mr. Grayson. I'm certainly not a therapist. I'm just the housekeeper." Nathaniel gave a tired half-smile. "Clara, we've had therapists, specialists, all kinds of professionals. None of them made him pick up a crayon. You did." Clara looked down at her hands. They were rough from years of work, nails trimmed short, skin dry. Hands that used to hold brushes and blend colors now held mops and laundry baskets. She hadn't thought of herself as an artist in years. "I'm not trained for this," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "What if I do more harm than good?" Nathaniel sat then, folding his hands together. "What you did yesterday was the first sign of life I've seen in my son in half a year. That may not be therapy, Clara, but to me it means something. Maybe everything." There was a long silence between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside the window, the wind stirred the branches, and a few yellow leaves floated down. Clara's mind drifted, not to fear or self-doubt, but to Leo's blank eyes the day before, and then to the chaos of color he had poured onto that canvas. She remembered the weight in his silence. It was the same kind of silence she'd once carried herself, after losing someone dear. She hadn't expected to feel that connection. And now that it was there, she couldn't ignore it. She met Nathaniel's gaze. "All right," she said softly. "But not because I think I know what I'm doing. I'll do it for him. For Leo." Nathaniel nodded once, his eyes flickering with something close to gratitude. "That's all I ask." Later that evening, long after the dishes had been washed and the house had fallen into its usual hush, Clara stood alone in the small laundry room, her back against the cool wall. The conversation with Mr. Grayson lingered in her mind like a song she couldn't stop humming. He had asked her to spend more time with Leo, not as a therapist or expert, but as herself. As someone who had reached the boy in a way no one else could. She closed her eyes. In the quiet, she saw another boy, 12 years old, with curly hair and paint always smudged on his fingers. Matthew. Her son. The one she hadn't spoken about in years. The one whose laughter had once filled a tiny apartment with more warmth than any mansion ever could. He had been sensitive, creative, full of color and questions. Just like Leo. But Matthew had been sick in ways the doctors didn't fully understand until it was too late. Clara had spent every cent, worked every shift, prayed every night. And when she lost him, she buried not just a child, but a part of herself. The paints were packed away. The canvases were hidden. Life became about survival. And yet now in this grand aching house, another little boy had placed his feelings on a canvas for the first time, not because someone taught him how, but because someone quietly gave him permission to feel. Clara didn't know why she'd said those words to Leo. They had come from somewhere deeper than thought. Somewhere that still remembered how pain could be softened, not solved, not erased, but softened through color. No therapist had reached Leo. No doctor had cracked the shell he'd built around himself. But something in Clara's simple offer, "Just paint what you're feeling," had opened a door. A door that maybe only someone who'd once lost a child could find. The next morning, she knocked gently on Nathaniel's study door before he could call for her. "I'll do it," she said softly, standing in the doorway with her hands clasped. "Not because I know how to fix anything, but because I remember what it's like to feel broken. And sometimes, the only way out is through a picture." Nathaniel looked up from his desk. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. Clara nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the playroom, where Leo was already sitting on the rug, the same blank canvas in front of him, waiting. She wasn't doing this for a paycheck. She wasn't doing it to impress or to prove anything. She was doing it because in the silence of a grieving child, she had heard the echo of her own sorrow. And maybe, just maybe, helping Leo paint his pain was the only way she'd ever finish the unfinished painting in her own heart. Each afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock, Clara would set aside her cleaning supplies, wash the dust from her hands, and quietly make her way to the playroom. Leo was always there, already seated on the floor, legs crossed, a blank canvas before him and the box of crayons beside it. He never looked up when she entered, never greeted her. But he didn't leave either. And in Clara's mind, that was something. She never gave instructions. She never asked questions. Instead, she simply sat beside him, took out her own small sketchpad, and began to draw, soft lines, quiet strokes, nothing more. And beside her, Leo would begin to move. Not always right away, and never with enthusiasm, but with a kind of quiet purpose. He didn't speak. Not once. But he painted. He painted in colors that said more than words ever could. On one canvas, the deep swirl of navy and black spilled across the paper like a storm, grief and loneliness tangled together. On another, sharp streaks of red cut through the white like fire. Anger. Confusion. A scream trapped inside. But sometimes, there was yellow warm flickering patches like sunlight breaking through clouds. And Clara knew, without needing to ask, that those were the memories of Eleanor. The mother he missed, the warmth he longed for. They spoke through color, the two of them, one woman who had stopped painting after loss, and one boy who had just begun. And in the silence of that room, with only the sound of crayon tips against canvas, healing had started to take shape, one shade at a time. It wasn't long before the calm rhythm of Clara and Leo's silent afternoons was interrupted by outside opinions. One crisp Thursday morning, Dr. Amanda Kellerman, a child psychologist Nathaniel had hired months earlier, returned to the mansion for her routine check-in. Nathaniel, ever desperate for answers, had kept her on retainer even though Leo had shown little interest in her sessions. She glanced at the stack of canvases now piled neatly in a corner of the playroom. Her brows furrowed. "He's painting now?" she asked, somewhat skeptically. Nathaniel nodded, folding his arms. "Every day. With Clara." Dr. Kellerman pursed her lips. "I see." In his study, she sat across from him with a clipboard in hand and concern etched into her voice. "Mr. Grayson," she began, "I understand this must feel like progress, but I need to caution you. What Leo is doing may not be true healing. Painting can often serve as a way to avoid actual emotional confrontation. It's a coping mechanism, not a solution." Nathaniel stiffened. "But he's expressing something. Isn't that better than silence?" "Maybe," she replied gently, "but it could just be another way to retreat. He's still not speaking. Still not engaging. Sometimes, creative outlets allow children to build walls behind colors instead of facing their feelings head-on." Her words lingered long after she left. Nathaniel paced his study, troubled. Was it real progress, or just another illusion of movement in a house full of stillness? And for the first time since Leo had picked up a crayon, doubt crept back in. The next few days carried a quiet tension that Clara could feel in the air long before words confirmed it. Nathaniel no longer passed by the playroom like he used to, pausing silently to observe. Instead, he kept his distance, retreating into his study, emerging only for brief conversations with staff and the occasional call from Leo's doctors. One afternoon, as Clara was folding laundry in the hallway, he approached her, his tone polite, but clipped. "May I speak with you, Clara?" She followed him into the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. "I've been thinking," he began, pacing slowly behind his desk. "It's been weeks now. And while I appreciate your time with Leo, I'm beginning to wonder if any of this is actually helping." Clara stood quietly, waiting. He's still not talking. Still not using his right hand like he used to. "There's no measurable improvement," Nathaniel continued, voice growing tighter. "It feels like a distraction. A colorful game. A way to pass the time, not real progress." Clara met his eyes, calm but firm. "You think this is a game?" Nathaniel hesitated, then looked away. "I don't know what to think. But I'm not seeing results." Clara stepped forward, her voice soft, almost tender. "If you want results, Mr. Grayson, you can hire a machine. But if you want your son to be a person again, to feel, to grieve, to come back in his own time, you'll have to let him do it with color, not pressure." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. And though he said nothing more, Clara could see it, the battle behind his eyes between logic and love, between timelines and trust. Clara didn't raise her voice. She never did. But the words she spoke next landed with a quiet force that made Nathaniel stop pacing. "If you want quick results," she said gently, her hands folded in front of her, "then hire a machine. A program. Something that runs on data and deadlines." She took a slow breath, her eyes steady on his. "But if you want your son back, not just the shell of him, not just the version that speaks on command or smiles for the sake of appearances, but truly back, then you have to let him hurt. In his own way. In his own time. And right now, that way is through color." Nathaniel looked at her, unsure whether to feel challenged or comforted. "He's not avoiding his emotions, Mr. Grayson," Clara continued. "He's walking through them, with red, with blue, with yellow. He's screaming without words. Mourning without sound. And if we take that from him because it doesn't look like progress on a chart, then we're telling him his grief is only valid if it fits our schedule." For a moment, the room was still. The wind rustled faintly outside the tall windows, and the quiet tick of the grandfather clock echoed through the study. Nathaniel didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened slightly, but something in his expression had shifted, just barely. A crack in the wall. A question where certainty had once been. And Clara, sensing that was enough for now, turned to leave. Before stepping out, she added softly, "Let him feel, sir. Even if it's messy. Even if it scares you. That's the only way he'll ever find his way back." The trouble began with a single photo. One afternoon, while tending to the rose garden just outside the playroom window, a young groundskeeper named Tyler noticed the latest painting drying on the easel inside. The canvas caught his eye, bold streaks of yellow cutting through dark swirls of gray and blue. It was raw, haunting, and strangely beautiful. He hadn't meant to intrude, but something about the image stirred him. Without thinking, he took out his phone, zoomed in through the glass, and snapped a picture. That evening, he uploaded it to his personal social media account with a short caption, "The son of a billionaire and the housekeeper, art born from pain." He didn't tag anyone. He didn't expect much. By morning, it had gone viral. Thousands of people shared the post, drawn in by the mystery, the emotion, the quiet power of the child's expression. Comment sections buzzed with speculation. Who was the boy? Was it really the son of investment tycoon Nathaniel Grayson? Who was the housekeeper being mentioned? Some praised the raw honesty of the piece. Others criticized the presumed exploitation of a grieving child. When the headline reached Nathaniel's inbox, "Billionaire's broken son paints his pain with housekeeper's help," his heart dropped. He stormed through the house, phone in hand, rage boiling beneath his calm exterior. "Clara," he called, voice sharp. "Did you give someone permission to post Leo's painting?" She turned, confused. "What? No, I would never." But he wasn't listening. To him, it looked like betrayal. Public exposure of the one thing he held most private. And just like that, trust shattered. The study door slammed shut behind Nathaniel as he confronted Clara in the foyer, his voice colder than she'd ever heard it. "I trusted you," he said, holding up his phone with the article open, the painting glaring back at them in vivid color. "I let you into my son's world. And this is what you do with it." Clara's brow furrowed, confused and startled. "I don't understand. What is that?" "You don't understand," he snapped. Leo's painting, his pain, plastered all over the internet with headlines about some heartwarming bond between the billionaire's broken son and the housekeeper. "You didn't think I'd find out." Her voice trembled, but not with guilt, with hurt. "I didn't post anything. I didn't even know anyone had seen his work outside this house." Nathaniel shook his head, his disappointment sharper than anger. "Whether you meant to or not, you let this happen. You invited attention to something that was never meant for the world." "I would never exploit him," Clara said, standing tall despite the ache in her chest. "You know that." "I thought I did," he muttered, then turned away. "Gather your things, Clara. I need you to leave. Today." She stood frozen for a long second, searching his face for some hint of understanding, but found only a wall. No explanations. No time for the truth. Just silence. And the sound of Leo's footsteps upstairs, unaware that the only person who had truly seen him was about to disappear from his life. Clara didn't expect a goodbye, not from Nathaniel, and certainly not from Leo. She walked slowly down the long marble hallway, her footsteps echoing off the cold floor. In her hands was the small bag she had brought years ago, now filled with a few things she'd kept in the house, nothing more. As she reached the front door, she glanced back one last time. At the top of the stairs stood Leo. He didn't say a word. He didn't move for a moment. But his eyes, wide trembling, locked onto hers. She offered a faint smile, the kind meant to comfort, though her heart was breaking. Then, without warning, Leo's small hands reached for the box of crayons he had once guarded like treasure. He raised it above his head, and threw it. The box hit the floor with a sharp crack, crayons scattering across the tiles in a messy explosion of color. Red, blue, yellow. Everything he had used to speak now lay broken and silent. Clara froze. Leo turned and walked away. And in that single wordless act, he screamed louder than any voice ever could. The silence in the Grayson house was deeper than usual. Since Clara's departure, the once soft hum of healing had disappeared. Leo no longer sat in the playroom. The canvases remained blank. Crayons lay untouched where they had fallen days ago, still scattered like broken thoughts across the cold tile floor. Nathaniel moved through the house like a man haunted, not by ghosts, but by regret. He told himself he had done the right thing, protecting his son's privacy, shielding what little remained of their fragile world. But the stillness in Leo's eyes had returned, darker now, more hollow than before. The boy no longer even glanced up at his father. The quiet between them had become an abyss. Then one morning the young gardener, barely 20 and visibly nervous, knocked on Nathaniel's study door. "Sir," he said, shifting from foot to foot, "I need to tell you something." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "It was me," the boy confessed. "The photo. Leo's painting. I took it through the window. I didn't think, I just thought it was beautiful. It moved me. I never meant to cause trouble. I didn't ask Clara. She had nothing to do with it." For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in realization. The puzzle pieces fell together. Clara's confusion. Her hurt. Her innocence. She hadn't betrayed them. He had. Later that evening, driven by something heavy and unspoken, Nathaniel wandered into Leo's room. The boy was asleep, curled up on his side, his small hands tucked under his cheek. On the far desk, half hidden beneath a sketchpad, something caught Nathaniel's eye. A new canvas. He pulled it closer, heart pounding. It was unfinished, but unmistakable. On one side of the painting stood a small figure, Leo. On the other side, taller, rigid, was a man in a gray suit. Their faces were distant, disconnected. Between them was a thick, looming wall, painted in muted shades of gray, rough and impenetrable. The man's eyes were closed. But stretching from Leo's side, barely begun, was a bridge. Just a faint arc of white, like the beginning of hope, reaching toward the wall. Nathaniel stared at it for a long time. Leo wasn't painting pain anymore. He was painting truth. And in that truth was a message Nathaniel could no longer ignore. It wasn't Leo who needed to change. It wasn't Leo who had shut the world out. It was him. He had built the wall. He had kept his eyes shut. And Leo, wordless, wounded, had still tried to reach him. Nathaniel sank into the desk chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in months, he let himself cry. Not for Eleanor. Not just for Leo. But for the part of himself that had grown cold and silent, just like his son. The next morning, before the sun rose, Nathaniel made a call. And for the first time, he didn't call a therapist. He called Clara. It took Nathaniel nearly an hour to find the small brick duplex where Clara lived, tucked away on a quiet street lined with aging maple trees. The morning sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden haze across the sidewalks. He stood at her doorstep for several long minutes, the weight of a small weathered box in his hands heavier than it should have been. When the door finally opened, Clara appeared in a faded cardigan, surprised but calm, her expression unreadable. Nathaniel looked at her for a beat, then extended the box toward her, Leo's crayon box. Some of the corners were dented. The lid barely stayed shut. But it was still full of color. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, voice husky. Clara hesitated, then slowly reached out to take it. Her fingers brushed against his, and in that moment, everything unspoken passed between them, the trust broken, the pain endured, and something else, forgiveness. Nathaniel's voice cracked. "If you still feel like painting, my son is waiting for the next picture." Clara didn't answer right away. She opened the box and stared at the familiar sticks of color inside, some worn to the nub, others untouched. 1,000 memories swelled behind her eyes. Then she nodded. Just once. Weeks later, what was once the old sunroom at the back of the Grayson estate was transformed into something new. Easels lined the walls. Light poured in through tall windows. The air smelled of crayons and acrylics, and quiet music played in the background. Children sat cross-legged on cushions, each one lost in their own world of expression, some smiling, some silent, all painting freely. At the center of the room sat Leo, a brush in his left hand, his right hand resting nearby, relaxed and unafraid. Across from him, Clara guided a little girl through mixing blues and greens. Her eyes sparkled in a way they hadn't in years. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was a teacher, an artist, a healer. Nathaniel often stood just outside the door, watching but never intruding. And each time he saw his son dip a brush into color, each time he saw Leo's shoulders relax, his heart mended a little more. One afternoon, as Clara tidied up a drying rack, Leo approached her, holding a small canvas. On it, a single white bridge stretched between two figures, one tall, one small, both smiling. He handed it to her with quiet pride. And then, for the first time in nearly a year, Leo spoke. His voice was soft, unsure, but steady. "Thank you, for not wiping away my colors." Clara knelt beside him, her throat tight, her hand gently resting on his. "You brought them back, sweetheart," she whispered. "One stroke at a time." If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please consider leaving a like. It helps us share kindness, one story at a time. And if you believe, like we do, that the world could always use a little more compassion, a little more healing, and a little more hope, then we invite you to subscribe and join us each week for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.